Thank you, Chris. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Chris Cheffings from JNCC. Chris has a lifelong love of plants and joined JNCC as their plant specialist in 2003. She's now a senior manager at JNCC with particular responsibility for species surveys and analysis. She's been associated with the NPMS throughout its history, both as the original project manager within JNCC and as a volunteer. Chris will be sharing her reflections on designing the ideal plant monitoring scheme. Over to you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Julia, very much. And thank you, Jane, as well, for getting us going this morning. When I was asked to speak today, I knew absolutely straight away that what I wanted to do was to give everybody just a flavour of the work that went into making the National Plant Monitoring Scheme into the great success that it is today. I make no apologies. It's going to be a personal tale about my experiences and my perspectives. I know all of our partners um, would be able to bring their own reflections and their own journeys into how we've designed the scheme. So it's reflecting on my experiences that lies behind my title here. Yes, today we're celebrating having 10 years of field work. But before that, there were at least 10 years of work to make it happen. And I'll also just mention right now that whilst all of my slides today are carrying the JNCC logo, I could also claim to be representing BSBI, as for the huge majority of those 20 years of work, I've been either a BSBI council member or a BSBI trustee. I need to get that one. So I'm going to start by rewinding the clock. Actually, back to 2003, which, as Julia said, is when I started work for JNCC as plant specialist. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, George W. was the US President, but more important than any of that, a magnificent new plant atlas was just out. So at that time, JNCC was already partnering in quite a range of different surveys. We have the National Bat Monitoring Programme, the Goose and Swan Monitoring Programme, the Wetland Bird Survey, the Breeding Bird Survey, and the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But at that time, in 2003, there was nothing equivalent for plants. Obviously, as I said, there was the new plant atlas, so we now knew a lot about where plants were. But what we didn't know was how their numbers were changing, and it was those numbers, particularly for some of the apparently common species, which seemed so very important. And something that I heard many times back then was that what we really needed was a survey that would help us understand which plants might be the house sparrows of the plant world. So people want to know which are those apparently common species that are actually undergoing a really major decline. So it was made abundantly clear to me, practically from my very first day at JNCC, that I was expected to do something about this. I was expected to get a scheme up and running, design it, plan it, make it happen. And I really felt this pressure that I had to get this happening. But back then, I really didn't know what I could do about this. And I can remember every year at my annual review meeting, my boss at the time would just look at me in vague disappointment that I really hadn't managed to get far. And the problems around how I should go about this really seemed quite insurmountable at first. For instance, one thing that my boss said to me was that whilst he could understand that if we were counting birds, then you could get an absolute change in the number of birds out there. So that as we counted, we were seeing birds declining. But, he said to me, surely with plants, you might lose one plant and another one just grows up in its place. So that what you end up seeing is literally just green. Now, most of our other partnership schemes relied on people counting every single bird, every single butterfly or bat that they encountered whilst they were walking along a 1 kilometre transect line. So let's imagine that for plants. Here's a photograph. This is the start of your transect. Let's start walking and counting. How many individual plants have you got here right at the start? So this again seemed an impossibility. And I can remember so many conversations at the time of people just going, well, it's impossible, isn't it? And even more, we all know that sometimes we don't even really know how to define what an individual plant is. They have rhizomes, they have vegetative spread. I don't know how many plants there are in this photo if we're counting individuals. Another point, bats, butterflies, birds, they all have relatively few species in the whole group. Whereas for plants, there are many more species. It depends how you count them, but well over 2,000 in the UK. So it's much more difficult to say that any scheme volunteer would have to be able to identify absolutely every single species that they encounter. Although I would say there is the advantage that at least they don't fly away just when you've managed to look up how to identify them. Now, fortunately for me, I was also working on a completely separate project at that time, which was trying to design ways to monitor the biodiversity condition of habitats. And it was really working on that project that convinced me that if we were to combine measuring how the plant species were changing, maybe just a small set of plant species, because the method for habitat condition uses indicator species. So if we were to combine those measures with measuring the habitats that the plants were living in, maybe we would be able to provide informative measures of how both plants and the habitats and the countryside were changing. So that allowed me to move from this feeling of this is all just green to saying, well, maybe this picture that you can see, it's improved grassland, may have exactly the same number of plant individuals in it as this second picture, but I think we all know which one of these, no matter the numbers of plants, we would prefer to be seeing, which one is more diverse, which one is more valuable for biodiversity. So it was really by starting to gain some of these insights that it stopped feeling like a completely intractable problem and started to feel like something that's just the germ of the NPMS that you would recognize today. So, yes, I had some ideas about how we might start to combine plant thinking and habitat thinking and understand how both were changing. But I was still feeling really quite on my own with this problem. Although I'm not quite sure why I should have felt on my own, because what was obvious was that I needed friends. And I said right at the start of my talk that I was at that time a member of BSBI Council. I am a member of Plant Life, and I was already the member of JNCC staff responsible for our partnership with UKCEH for the Biological Records Centre. So I had all of these friends already. I just really needed to start working with them and talking to them and starting co-designing the survey so that I was not just sat at my desk trying to think what to say to my boss this year. If we were going to build a successful plant survey, then obviously it needed to appeal to the organisations that were already working on recording plants, and even more, it needed to appeal to all of you who are out there volunteering. So I should say also at this point, I'm not ignoring the input that the British Trust for Ornithology had into the design. They were a key additional friend at that time, as were some statisticians from BIOS in Scotland. So back in 2009, I'm up to now, I let what I would have to say is a ridiculously overambitious contract. And this, what I've got here on the slide, is an extract from the exact contract document that went out in 2009. And I've put in bold, the overarching objective is to design ideal plant surveillance. I'm stunned really that any of our partners were willing to take this contract on at all. But I knew that's what I wanted. I knew that's what JNCC wanted. Um, I knew only this contract was going to be enough to um, win the support of my boss, of JNCC, and get funding. What was more, I was going to have to impress my boss's dog at the same time. So my boss back at that time, he had the most incredible, annoying habit of turning up, standing next to my desk, usually on a Monday morning, and informing me exactly what species changes were occurring across the UK, which he'd observed just while walking his dog. So any survey that was going to be designed was going to have to provide more than what had already just appeared to him on his walks with his dog. So I felt, I had my friends on board with this contract. There were ideas beginning to flow around how plant communities and habitats were changing. And we moved then into a really intensive design period. And I really remember this period very fondly. Um, if you can imagine this intense work period, we were constantly exchanging emails, phone calls, having new ideas, organizing workshops where we were brainstorming options. It was a really productive atmosphere. So by the end of 2010, and again, I know this looks like a horrendous slide. This is deliberate. This is the slide I had at the end of 2010 to present information to my committee, the final C of JNCC, the committee who control our purse strings. So there were more slides in that presentation. You're not going to have to suffer the whole thing. But what this one shows is on the left, you can see all of the different options that we had considered about the problem I talked about at first. How do you get around this problem of counting on a transect? And then on the right, that shows all of the different flowering times for plants in different habitats so that we could start to think what times of year would we have to say to volunteers that they would need to go out to record. So the reason this slide is so busy is because I had to convince my committee that we really knew how we were going to design this thing, that this was something that we could get behind, that they could get behind, and that it was going to work. And I really needed to build that belief in the design, because the next steps were inevitably going to be fairly expensive and also fairly irrevocable, because what you really don't want to do with a volunteer survey is to say, we're now setting up a new long-term survey, and then 1 year later it just disappears completely. So it took from that end of 2010 until 2013, and uh, Jane has already mentioned some of the piloting that was going on in those in between years. So by 2013, I had built enough belief within JNCC that I was then allowed to commission the final design stages. So that 2009 work had looked at lots of options, but it hadn't made the final design decisions, and it hadn't been fully field tested. There'd just been a small pilot. So we entered another really, really intensive design phase. There were more emails exchanged, more phone calls, more workshops, and even this time, some proper field testing. I talked earlier on about the difficulties of knowing how to count and what area or place to count in. And this was the time when those decisions were finalized. We knew that plant communities were usually based on understanding the percentage cover of plants. And so that was what we settled on using, although there were lots of concerns about how difficult that was going to be to do reliably. We also had lots of discussions about the size of the quadrats and how that size and shape would need to change for some particular habitats. One of the big and particularly horrendous decisions to make was around how to explain where to place the quadrats. We really wanted to ensure good sample design, but we also had to target particular habitats and at the same time acknowledge that some possible plot locations would be entirely inaccessible. So I well remember doing the recce visit for my own square. I dutifully trekked off to the first of the possible looking plots that was marked as being in priority habitat, only to find that it was completely impenetrable scrub on a hillside so steep that you could almost call it a cliff. I headed off to the second possible location that I'd noted. It was exactly the same. I had no luck at all until I got to the third possible position, by which time I was already somewhat exhausted and I wasn't sure I quite had the energy to find more plots. The species lists for the wildflower and indicator levels were another decision point that went absolutely right to the wire. And I can remember Plant Life, who were the partner responsible for getting the plant guide produced. They were pleading with us to make final decisions so that that could be written, designed, and printed in time. And then, of course, there were the habitats themselves. Um, should you use the European UNIS system or the UK-based system of broad and priority habitats? Some UK countries wanted one system, others wanted another. And whichever you chose, it was going to have to be recognizable in the field. So this was where the field testing really, really came into its own and helped us to realize that we were going to have to use a hierarchical system in which you could choose to list your habitat either at a broad or a finer level. And again, this chimed with my own experience when I tried to decide the habitat for that first successfully placed plot that I had. It was very obvious that I was standing in a grassland. It was a field and it had some slightly curious cows checking me and my uh, string for my quadrat out. But what kind of grassland was it? It wasn't improved grassland, as I had plenty of flowers and diversity around me, but I was really struggling to place it. I knew that theoretically I was standing on some chalk in terms of geology, but at the same time, it really didn't strike me as a typical calcareous grassland. So, did that mean I was standing in neutral grassland? Or did it alternatively mean that it was just a somewhat degraded calcareous grassland? Ultimately, I simply couldn't decide, so I recorded it as lowland grassland and felt very pleased that that hierarchical option was available to me. So finally, we reached 2014 and we had a design that worked, or at least we hoped it worked. And both my boss and his dog were sufficiently on board with all of the work that had been done, that we were able to agree JNCC funding alongside all of the other partners. I know I couldn't have done this on my own, and I didn't. And it was really foolish to even attempt to design it on my own. But it was a wonderful, wonderful moment for me after 10 years of work, some frustrations, some disappointments when things didn't work the way we wanted them to. But also, I would just say some truly wonderful moments with all of my friends, working hard together to get a design that would work. It, I really look back and it's been such a fantastic experience. So 10 years on, we're finally able to replay that slide of schemes. Now still got the bats, we've still got the geese and swan, we've still got the wetland birds and the breeding birds and the butterflies. But now we have the NPMS as well, taking its rightful place right there. And in fact, these days, we've also added in to the schemes, the pollinator monitoring scheme too. And all of these schemes are producing really high quality data every single year. Um, and we are now being able to say how plants and their communities are changing. And that is thanks to everyone. It's thanks to everyone who helped in the design of the scheme, but more importantly, it's thanks to everybody who volunteers in the scheme to get those data. So thank you all very much indeed for listening to me reflecting on my time designing it. And as I say, I know all of our partners would have their own tales to tell of what they wanted to do to get plant surveillance up and running and how this all managed to come together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a really fascinating insight into the co-design journey for the programme. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions for Chris, do please put them in the Q&A box. We have one question. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the JNCC is, what the initials stand for?
Yes, that's fine. Yes, and I did consider saying that right at the start, but I get so I'm tired of saying what JNCC is. I thought I'd just jump to the point. Anyway, so the JNCC, it stands for the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, um, and but I would have to say that that doesn't really tell you a great deal. We are a government advisor, so we're an arm's length body that advises government, and uniquely, we're the arm's length body that advises all 4 UK governments and also on international biodiversity matters and within the UK's overseas territories. So, whilst you may have heard of Nature Scot or Natural England, those are the individual country advisory bodies, we advise on the whole of the UK and internationally.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Claire Million, who asks, are there any similar schemes in other countries?
Outside of the UK, I am aware of a very few, and when we were designing this, we tried very hard to look for similar models that we could copy. And at the time, they were very, very few and far between. There are similar schemes to the extent that they are recording plants, using volunteers in a semi-systematic way in a few countries. I'm aware of something in Sweden, the Netherlands, and South Africa and Australia, but they're not exactly the same. They're not using the same methods that we have.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, I think we are going to take other questions for you in the discussion session, in the panel discussion at 1:30 today, and we'll move on to our next speaker. So thanks ever so much, Chris.